Solomon says there's a time for everything under the sun. So there is a time for forgiveness. When is that time? And most importantly, when is that time for you? When do you know that it's time to forgive? We all know by experience that trying to force forgiveness onto somebody or onto ourselves doesn't lead to the desired outcome. On the contrary, when you try to force into forgiveness, usually what you get is resentment or, milder tone, withdrawal. Forgiveness is a time-consuming process because it takes time to change things within ourselves. It takes time to rethink the situations and people and their roles in our lives. It takes time to process everything, to feel everything. Sometimes it takes time to experience the wide range of emotions that lead to forgiveness. So, as with any grieving story, there is not a prescribed time for forgiveness. It's rather the fact that we need to understand what unforgiving means to us. And when that pressure builds within us, then the time to forgive becomes obvious. Even so, we know that between acknowledging that we need to forgive and the time that we actually accomplish that can be a very long and sometimes very painful road. So the time to forgive is your own time. When you feel the need, when you see the outcomes of unforgiving, when you feel the pressure, when you feel the poison, when you feel the hurt, when you find yourself going round and round in circles, thinking over and over about the things that hurt you, then is the time to forgive. On the other side, sometimes we may not realize or acknowledge this time. So even though being pressured into forgiving does not help, sometimes a hint, an idea, a word from somebody that we treasure, that we think is important in our lives, may be the spark that bursts open the floods of forgiveness. It may be the fact that somehow we have a blind spot to ourselves. We do not really see clearly some of the most important aspects of our lives. It's as though we can see clearly everything around, but that part of our existence is a blind spot where nothing happens. And when we're trapped, when we feel like nothing is going right, when we feel that we cannot go on, that something is wrong, but we cannot really say what, sometimes it may be because we are trapped in that blind spot. This is why the time to forgive, as time-consuming as may be as a process, may start long before we acknowledge it. But until we actually realize that we need to forgive, until we make the voluntary and conscious decision to forgive, the time to forgive has not really come for us. So we may be pleasant to others. We may say that we forgive people, but in reality, the psychological time to forgive has not started. The process has not engaged us yet. But when it comes, when the moment arrives and we realize we need to forgive, that is only the first step of forgiveness. It's only the first moment of a very long process. The biggest the hurt, the greater the pain, the more complex the relationship, the longer it takes to forgive. The closest the people who have hurt us, the more it takes to forgive them. Because it is easier to set aside and to distance ourselves from people who didn't have such an important role in our lives. It doesn't feel as though we are cutting such a big part of our existence. But when it happens to areas of our lives that are very significant for us, when the hurt and the pain and the betrayal comes from somebody who has been so close and so important to us, forgiving needs a lot of time and a lot of effort. So this is why acknowledging that you need this time is a way of setting very realistic expectations about what forgiveness can do in your life and can change for you. If you expect things to get better overnight, then you set yourself for failure and for more hurt. Realizing that it may take a while is a wise approach when you are the one who has to ask for forgiveness. Because the moment that you realize you've hurt somebody, so you're on the other side of the conflict, and you realize that you desperately want that relationship to function again, because it's important and valuable, and sometimes because we hurt people without meaning to. Usually, what you do is go to that person and ask for forgiveness and say you're sorry and maybe explain what you're feeling. And the desire, the impulse is to ask for a positive reaction as soon as possible. But if you understand the meaning of time in the forgiveness process, then you realize that you need to offer that time to the person that you're asking for forgiveness from. You need to let that person live the emotion, experience it, and then search for the right words to express it. Because we all know from previous experiences, as many as we can count, that sometimes we've been so hurt and so upset, and we've been waiting for people to ask for forgiveness from ourselves. But the minute they do so, we explode with the huge amount of frustration and pain and rage, and we pour all that, even though we've been meaning and wanting to forgive them. And sometimes that damages the relationship more. But when you understand that it takes time to feel and to leave everything, it takes time to understand, it takes time to retell a story, then you understand that forgiveness doesn't come overnight. Sometimes it does. If something is easy to forgive, if it doesn't mean that much to us, if we have other areas of our lives that are very well developed and very interesting and very active at the moment, it may be easier to forgive. But anyway, forgiving is a time-consuming process. And sometimes it's a process that needs to be retaken and relived several times before we get to the point where we can actually feel healed. So take your time and give others the time they need to forgive. And understand that even though you cannot force, you cannot pressure forgiveness, you can nurture it. You can give yourself that time, that private psychological space where you can heal and think over and find the right words for emotions, for thoughts, for mending relationships, for understanding better who you are and what you've become. But most importantly, if you're at that time, at that moment where you realize you need to forgive, prepare yourself for a process. Prepare yourselves to take the steps to forgiveness one at a time while telling a new story. And that is something that we'll talk about in our next video.